in terms of the program, in terms of timing, now they should be arriving at the Windsor Castle any time now. The procession is going to be then reaching the west steps of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle any time now. Sally is joining us now, our correspondent. Sally Patterson, good afternoon again. Well, it looks like the procession is now getting closer and closer to Windsor Castle.
That's right. We've seen these really extraordinary images coming out of that route from the from London, central London, where the funeral was held, all the way along the back roads to Windsor Castle, where there will, of course, be the committal service at around 4 o'clock local time in just over an hour. And so that hearse and that whole funeral procession should be arriving at Windsor Castle any time now. And we know that armed forces are lining the road on the way up to the castle, which was, of course, known as one of the Queen's favourite homes. She spent a significant amount of time there, especially as she got older. Excuse me, she preferred to be in Windsor Castle than in Buckingham Palace in the hustle and bustle of London city life. So this really does have a very special place in her heart. It's where she spent many, many happy years. And we also know that at this ceremony later today, we'll be seeing members of the royal household who will be joining the royal family there. We're expecting around 800 guests, whereas earlier we saw around 2,000 guests at the funeral itself, including, of course, world leaders and dignitaries, kings, queens, prime ministers, presidents. This is going to be a smaller scale. It's going to be more for the people who knew the Queen well, who served her either now or several years ago, and it's going to be a much smaller affair. And then later on in the day, we're going to have an even smaller ceremony, which is really just going to be for family. It's not going to be live streamed. It's going to be very private. It's very intimate, and that really is an opportunity for her mourning family to say their own farewell, to say that final goodbye before she is buried with her late husband, Prince Philip, and the two of them will be buried together in Windsor Castle.
Together with Father King George VI and the Queen Mother and the sister. And I understand, Sally, this will be it for that small corner of that chapel where Queen Elizabeth II will be buried and laid to rest there with Prince Philip, because there's no more space. And we were just marveling here. I've got a studio guest, Bishop Charles May from the Anglican Church in South Africa, and we're just marveling at how the monarch, having been Queen, you are laid to rest in a very small corner in a chapel, and he reminded me that that's where she used to go and worship. That was a place of solace.
That's right. We need to remember that the Queen was, of course, a woman of faith. She was always very much part of her church. She was, of course, head of the Church of England, and she was a practicing Christian, and we saw that reflected in the funeral earlier today, where we saw a number of hymns sung, ones that were her favourites that she'd actually chosen, those that were really close to her heart. And we also saw, of course, a sermon by the Archbishop of Canterbury, which spoke not only about the kind of person that the Queen was, but also about her faith. And it was a religious ceremony, and so, of course, when she was in Windsor, she would go to St. George's Chapel there, which is where this ceremony will be held, which was a much more intimate atmosphere there. It's much smaller, and it was where she would go and pray, and where her family continued to pray. And it was, of course, where Philip, her late husband's funeral was just a year ago, when he died in April 2021. So this chapel has particular meaning for her, but actually churches across the United Kingdom and indeed around the world were significant for a woman whose faith was a very big part of her life.
Yeah, and it's just wonderful to see today as well. After 10 days of mourning and 10 days of people paying their respects, including people queuing up to 13 hours just the other day to go and pay their last respect while she lies in state, that even now there's still thousands of people who've lined the streets. Sally, I understand from Bishop May here with me in the studio that he's had reports that 750,000 people have traveled from outside the UK to come and witness this moment.
We don't have the exact figures yet. Of course, those are still going to be counted up over, and it might take a while to do that. But there were estimates that there would be at least 1 million people here in London today. Over the last few days, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people swarm to the Capitol in order to be part of what really is a once-in-a-lifetime event over these past 10 days. Over the past 4 days, the Queen has, of course, been lying in state in Westminster Hall, my apologies, just behind me. And that before that, she was in Scotland, and then from there she was moved to Westminster Abbey, where the funeral was held today. But there were queues of people lining the streets of London, waiting for their opportunity to go and see that coffin for themselves. It's very different, of course, to see it on the television because it was being live streamed, and to see it with your own eyes, and to spend up to 12 hours in that queue. And of course, British people are known for their love of queuing, and it was a very organised, a very respectful queue where people waited patiently in line, some bringing camping chairs, waiting overnight. It did get rather cold here in the evenings, but people were prepared to wait for their chance to file past that coffin. Some people crossed their chests, some people said a short prayer, some people just stood momentarily in silence looking up at the Queen, who was such a big part in their lives, and who was the only monarch most of them had ever known until King Charles took to the throne just a few days ago. And so we really have seen hundreds of thousands of people come through the streets of London, and of course what that's needed is a huge amount of security. We've had 10,000 police officers on the streets of London today, brought in from all over the United Kingdom. Different forces have lent their officers to the Metropolitan Police in London. We've also seen military personnel on the streets offering their support as well, and even private security officials who have come to help as well, because with so many people there is of course the risk of things going wrong. But as people have been saying, it's actually been an incredibly well-behaved crowd. People have wanted to be close to the Queen, but they've understood that, there's a lot of people and they've stood waiting their turn. People have thrown flowers. People have tried to get to the front, but it has on the whole been a very respectful and a very well-behaved crowd that we've seen here over the last few days.
Yeah, right up to this last minute. We are watching the live visuals as we speak to you, Sally, of the hearse. The state hearse now slowly approaching Windsor Castle. We've just had a visual there as well, a view of the west steps of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and you can just see the honor with which the people, the respect with which they are paying, they are bidding farewell to Queen Elizabeth II. And there's the hearse. It's just about to get to Windsor. We're gonna have to wait and see what's going to be happening when the bearer party lifts the coffin from the hearse and to be carried in procession. And that will be the last procession I think we'll see for the day into the chapel. Before the committal service. Sally, I understand the committal service will be shorter than the state funeral service, the ecumenical state funeral service that we saw earlier at Westminster Abbey.
Well, this is, as we've seen earlier, we've already seen the funeral today, which was a major event. It had dignitaries from around the world, 2,000 people crammed into Westminster Abbey. All of the airs and graces that come with a state funeral. We saw the military operations lining the streets. We saw the fanfare, and this ceremony later on is going to be much, much smaller. It's going to be much more intimate. It doesn't have to go through those same formal procedures. This is something for those who knew her best, to reflect on Queen Elizabeth's life, and this is for, as I said, members of her household and other members of the royal family. And so this will be a smaller, shorter, more intimate affair without all of the ceremonial things that we've seen over the past few hours here in London, which was in some ways as much for the public and as much for people watching at home, the billions of people watching this televised event on TV. a lot of this procession was important for them, but this that we're about to see is going to be far more for the people who knew the Queen most.
Yeah, Sally, thank you very much. Bishop May, before we say goodbye to you from the studios here, while I've got Sally on the line, from the Anglican Church, I mean, the committal service you said is going to be done in a much more churchy way. This is a church now that she belonged to as a woman of faith, and how important is that this whole service today, this whole farewell today is ending like this?
It is very much important in terms of, from the church. It was the service where the commendation and thanksgiving to God was done in terms of the message, and now it is the opportunity of the family to say their farewell bidding, and that's why we've got the prayer of bidding in the order of service. So it's really bidding farewell to the loved one.
So this is just how it's important it's going to be. Bishop Charles May, thank you very much for having been with us here most of the day.